Hello, my name is Billy Graves. I am a debater for the University of Houston, and today I negate the resolution resolved that all states have an obligation to anticipate, prevent, and minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. Contention 1 is the question of obligations. There are two key parts to any obligation. The A point is the ethical obligation, and the B point is the obligation to its citizens. For the A subpoint, the ethical obligation is a question of environmental justice. It isn't right for developing nations to have the same standards as developed nations due to the principle of reciprocity. Henry Shue, professor of politics and international relations at Oxford University, explains this principle in regards to the environment. If I do not plan to renounce these benefits, I can hardly refuse to acknowledge the cost that their production also yielded. This idea is key to understanding reciprocity, and in the context of the environment, it's very similar to giving what you take. Without understanding the issue of reciprocity, it is impossible to understand environmental ethics. When a country has not developed enough, it isn't right to say they have an ethical obligation to minimize the causes of climate change when they need to use these very factors of climate change in order to develop. Which brings me to my B subpoint, that a country's main obligation to its citizens is to protect the general well-being. Developing countries are over 80% of the population, and thusly they bear the effects of much of the negative effects of climate change. However, it's not only the issue that they are a substantive part of the population, rather it's also an issue that they don't have the infrastructure necessary to combat these. One of the ways they would be able to do this is through extended growth with GDP. Growth of GDP is very substantial. However, the economists noticed a relationship between adverse effects of climate change and GDP. It noted that Africa will lose up to 4% of the GDP and India up to 5%. This loss in GDP is a harm not only to the state but also to the citizens. GDP has been clearly correlated with higher life expectancy as well as better situations within the state. Blindly attaching luxury taxes to luxury emissions for these developing countries shouldn't be a standard. They should be allowed to emit some of this to ensure that the state citizens don't waste away from these catastrophic effects of climate change. Contention 2 is that current international obligations don't allow for climate models to work for all states. There are many current ideas in regards to climate change. One can remember the Kyoto Protocol, which ended up almost being a complete failure. One of the biggest reasons as to why was because developed and developing countries didn't see eye to eye. In fact, the Mary Robinson Foundation, an organization founded by the former president of Ireland to support climate justice, explained in an article that there is a lack of trust between developed and developing nations, which contributes to the paralysis in the UNFCCC for the last 20 years. Climate change policies have empirically failed in the past, and they won't work in the future unless they have a meeting in the middle in regards to equity, so developed and developing countries can see eye to eye. Moreover, Mo Wang, professor of environmental studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Science, explains what's going on currently. In recent years, some parties have sought to redefine the meaning of equity and the common but differentiated responsibilities principle, thereby advocated undifferentiated emissions reductions, commitments and actions across access developed and developing countries. These recent ideas are not equitable. Their demand for every state to do the same thing and not taking into account what each state has released previously, meaning that developed and developing countries will not be able to see eye to eye on these issues.